On today's episode of the Black Studies Podcast, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Janet E. Helms, co founder of Psychologists for Racial Justice, Augustus Long Professor Emeritus from Boston College, and a licensed psychologist. She is past president of the Society of Counseling Psychology, Division 17 of the American Psychological Association. Dr. Helms is the 16th most influential psychologist in the country, according to an AI ranking based on her scholarship on race, racism, and other isms or conditions of societal oppression. She is the author of the McGuffrey Longevity Award winning book, A Race is a Nice Thing to Have, a guide to being a white person or understanding the white persons in your life. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Janet E. Helms, Augustus Long Professor Emeritus in the Department of Counseling, Developmental, and Educational Psychology at Boston College and co-founder of Psychologists for Racial Justice. Hi, Dr. Helms. How are you doing today?
Hi, I'm doing pretty well today. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm so glad to have you here. Thank you for agreeing to speak with me for the podcast.
Well, thank you for talking to me. Not many people want to talk about racism, so I'm happy to be here.
So we can dive in by talking about that, right? So, how did you come to focus on racism as an area of study?
Well, I don't actually focus on racism as an area of study. I focus on racism as a background for the various things that I study.
Okay.
So, what I mean by that, for instance, is that I'm actually trained to be a mental health professional as a psychologist. But as a mental health professional, I know that a lot of the symptoms or the illnesses or even the accomplishments that people have, they do within the context of racism in the background.
Mhm.
So, we know that there are mental health disparities, whereas uh, Black people, for instance, receive more severe diagnoses than white people who have the same symptoms. Well, that's racism. And so a part of what I do is just to identify what we think of as common knowledge and then take a look at what is the racism that actually underlies that common knowledge so that we can begin to treat the real issues rather than focusing on Black people specifically as being deficient in some way.
I know we talked a little bit about this when we met earlier this summer. Um, how do you see that framing and that acknowledgement as important to being connected to Black studies and doing work that is focused on and rooted in Black people and Black ways of knowing?
Okay, so there is a racism in the background answer to that question as well. Um, and I hope that I say this so that it doesn't sound like I don't think that Black studies are important. But in fact, Black studies exist because of racism.
Mhm.
If we did not live in a society, and I'm talking about the United States because that's where I live, if we did not live in a society where the history and experiences of Black people were marginalized, then we would not have to call it Black studies. We would call it American studies, focused on the culture of African peoples.
Mhm.
We don't talk about white studies, and that's because implicitly white studies are what we study, and that's racism. When we assume that whites are the standard for everything else that we do and give labels to things that are not white. So the way that racism exists with respect to Black studies, in my opinion, is that Black studies help us to see the issues, to understand the issues, to understand the culture, to understand the effects of racism. But we always have to recognize that Black studies exist because racism exists. And that
Mhm.
doesn't mean that Black studies would go away if we got rid of racism. Not that we're probably ever going to get rid of racism, but it does not mean that that's what would happen. What it would mean is that we ought to live in a place where the cultures of the peoples of the world, of society, are important, and we don't have to treat them as though they're something different and specialized. They're something that we ought to all know about.
Mhm.
And so I see Black studies as, in a sense, holding the knowledge so that when the society, the country catches up with it, they will have it there. They will know that it's there. It will be there despite the efforts of racism to destroy it.
Thank you. That really, one, that's a hopeful perspective that that we can get to that point. Um, but I do think what you said is important, right? That Black studies is holding the knowledge, and that it wouldn't be Black studies if there wasn't the racism that necessitates a specific call for the inclusion of Black knowledge and Black stories into our culture and education system. So thank you for that.
And the valuing of it.
Yes. Yeah.
Uh, yes.
That yeah, the value, that part. Um, so how do you see the work that you do with the background of racism being there and how that has influenced the work that you have specifically done? How do you see that as comparing to maybe more traditional paths that people take in the field of psychology?
Um, so when I was a beginning psychologist uh, centuries ago, um, I thought what I would be doing was establishing community mental health centers for Black people because the ones that were in existence weren't in existence, essentially. But as I entered graduate school, I found out that even mentioning Black people was considered dealing with politics. And traditional psychology did not deal with politics, it dealt with science. And so, my education in psychology, and actually today, most people's education in psychology focused on what's called traditional psychology, which is it was supposed to be objective. It wasn't supposed to deal with issues of race because that was political, unless you were a white person studying people of color, especially Black people, then it was okay. If you were a Black person or a person of color studying your own group, that was political.
Mhm,
So a lot of my uh, influence on the field was that, or how I was entered what I do is I would say I want to study something about Black people for my research program. Psychologists have to have research programs. So I would say that's what I want to do. And they would say, you will never get anywhere in psychology if that's what you do. So, what you have to do is you have to have a traditional psychology pathway, and then you can do this other thing as your hobby. So, I essentially learned all of the traditional methodologies that psychologists do. And I'm not bragging to say that I can do those pretty well. Um, but I also recognize the extent to which those methodologies, what you got from those methodologies, just didn't make sense in terms of what I knew about people on a people level.
mhm,
And I guess one of my ongoing issues has been the issue of standardized testing. It doesn't make sense to me that on average, white people are smarter than Black people, because I know some of both, and that's just not true. So a lot of my work then has been focused on what is the racism? What is the implicit racism that allows traditional psychology to uh, make the inferences it does, that leads society to make the inference it does about Black people. And more than anything, psychology has shaped how we think about the intelligence of Black people.
mhm.
And they've done that by means of standardized testing. And so, almost from the beginning, a lot of what I've been doing is showing how the methodology that's used to test people just doesn't work with respect to Black people and other people of color for that matter.
Okay, I have a couple follow-up questions. One, so in showing that, right, in being able to scientifically show that, like, this testing is not working for certain groups of people, what have been some of the reactions that you got to that research and being able to show that as true?
Um, well, there's the reaction of the traditional psychologist, which is essentially to defame my character, uh, because that's what happens when you study racism.
Mhm.
But then there have been the reactions of the increasing numbers of psychologists of color who recognize that what I'm doing gives them a new language for talking about what it is that they do. And so I guess I say I still live in those two worlds. One where I'm still trying to educate traditional psychology, and one where I'm helping to educate uh, people of color, especially Black psychology, with respect to these issues. And it's not easy because even Black psychologists of color, have been trained in the framework of traditional psychology. So
Mhm.
you almost have to teach people to think differently about what it is that they've learned so that they can learn something new. And that's true whether it's traditional psychology or people of color.
Thank you. I know that the traditional training and the ways in which the work that you do allows for a different way to look at things, but that pushes against those boundaries of what people have considered to be psychological research in the field of psychology. Um, yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot. One, but I guess what I'm trying to get get at is asking, what is some of the language and the framing that pushes those boundaries and that provides that new framework for other psychologists to build from?
Um, I'm not quite sure I understand that question. Um, okay, let's try this as an example and see if this works. Um, One of the areas I am often considered to have developed or expanded on is racial identity.
Mhm,
Um, for a long time, and even now, people think about racial identity as what you call yourself or what people call you. What I have been able to do is two things. One is to define uh, Black identity, people of color identity, not in terms of the label per se, but in terms of how you react to the socialization, the racism you receive as a result of that labeling. So um, I talk about the lenses through which people see themselves. So, are they do they conform? If they're people of color, do they conform to racism essentially? Are they the ones who say, I'm better than the other people like me? Are they confused and don't know how to think about issues? Or are they angry and in many ways self-destructive because of the racism they experience? Or are they able to, uh, in some sense, transcend the racism and resist it in ways that are helpful for them? So, with respect to people of color, that's how I use racial identity. But then when there are always two sides for me. So the side that people eventually or began to accept that viewpoint because they could recognize it. You could see the different ways in which uh, Black people reacted to their racism socialization.
mhm,
But Black people wouldn't have racism socialization unless white people were socializing them to have racism socialization through racism. So I also invented white identity, racial identity theory, which talks about the lenses through which white people react to racism. As the beneficiaries of racism, they also have to go through a process or need to go through a process, or I would hope they go through a process where they eventually recognize how they benefit unfairly from racism and overcome that benefit. So I talk about them, for instance, as first, maybe using the glasses to say, "Oh, aren't these Black people cute?" I wanna be like them, but not too much.
Mm.
And then then they get confused and because, people don't like, white people becoming too friendly with black people, and so then they become confused. "Well, what do I do?" Morally, I'm supposed to like people regardless of their race, but I know I'm gonna lose my inheritance if I keep hanging out with these black people, so I'm confused. What do I do? Then they begin to develop a lens where they think, well, the reason why I have all of these privileges in society is because I'm the best. I deserve them. Is something wrong with those people, or I wouldn't have all of the benefits? And then gradually they can begin to move towards places where they recognize their responsibility for the racism, the privilege that they hold, and begin to recognize that they have to see how it works for them and make the conscious decision to give it up. That's where I get the pushback. And that in many respects, that's the most fun because, um for a long time, people did not know that I was a psychologist of color. When I, published the book on white identity, they thought that they thought I was white. In fact, when I went to South Africa, they were surprised that I was not a white man. And
Okay.
so the reason for that was that in the beginning, they thought, "How can a black person know white people this well?" Well, I contend that most black people know white people that well because we have to in order to survive. The only
Mhm.
difference was that I wrote it down, and with the help of my sister, I was able to publicize it and get it out into the world, particularly the younger generation, so that they began to say, "Well, hey, this clicks for me. This is how I am here. This is how I am here, and this is how I need to begin to change." The older generation hates it, hated it. Uh, I tried to steal it, all all sorts of reactions, but, that's a part of the fun of it. When you connect with something that connects with the people, then the people who are invested in the continued oppression of people, sooner or later, have to give it up. And so, um, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's one example.
No, that does. Thank you. That was a really, helpful example, and it definitely responded to the question and provided a really good a concrete example of how the work that you have done speaks to speaks back to the traditional field of psychology in the ways in which it neglected, erased, did not consider or want to consider um, race when it was being studied by Black people. So, thank you. I know one of the things that you are very well known for is also your commitment to mentorship. You've mentored a lot of students over your career. Um, what are some of the biggest lessons that you emphasize to your students?
Throughout my journey in psychology, I was always an only. So, like, I was the only one in uh, all of my graduate classes. I was the only one in most of the universities where I held positions. And so, um, only is not a good thing because in many ways you become symbolic for all of the images as well as expectations that people have for Black people, in my case. So, what I try to emphasize to my mentees is first that they are family. They may not be blood family, but they are academic family. They know each other's trials and tribulations, and so there are some rules. Even if you don't like the person personally, if I say this is a member of the family, that means that you can count on this person to help you if you need help. And so that's what I say to them. That's rule number one. Rule number two is that if you're about to get into trouble and you need me to help you get out of the trouble, you have to tell me before you get into the trouble so that I'm prepared. The third one then is that you got to think. I know that people have socialized you to believe that your thinking is not important, but your thinking is what you bring to the world. And so you got to think. Even if what you think is not something that I am personally interested in, I will become personally interested in it if you're invested in. So you got to think. I don't want to hear any of that. I'm giving up stuff because the ancestors who came before us did not give up. And so, at least for the present, we aren't responding to dogs and whips. So, if you're not responding to a dog or a whip, then I want you to work on it. I don't care what names people call you, names do hurt, but you can get over it. And it'll be so much fun when you do what you do that they said you could not do. And those are my rules.
I really appreciate that you say it's fun when you get to do what they said you couldn't do. I think that that is a very underemphasized or appreciated part of being able to engage in this kind of work, right? Like, yes, it's hard. You're going to deal with a lot, but then you get to, on the other end, have fun with what you're doing and know that what they said did not deter you from that, accomplishing that goal and being able to engage in that work.
Exactly. Strut your stuff.
So I want to ask, this was not a question that I sent you, but I did want to ask about your work with Psychologists for Racial Justice.
Yes. One of the things that, well, I always have to give you some history.
That's
Um,
fine.
I was the founding director of the Institute for the Study and Promotion of Race and Culture before I retired. And the Institute was essentially run by various cohorts of graduate students who were interested in racial justice. So they kept the Institute running. They became officially my board when I was in Boston College. So after I retired, we all became aware of the fact that no one was having conversations about race anymore. That in fact, people were beginning to use code words like DEI. They had used code words before like multiculturalism, but DEI was even further removed from a discussion of race than multiculturalism was. But meanwhile, all of this racist stuff was happening to people, and they weren't having any way to study it in psychology or to deal with it in society because race has suddenly become a four-letter word again.
Mm.
So the Psychologists for Racial Justice is essentially made up of members of my former ISPRC board, who together we host conferences, we do trainings, we do research that keeps the focus on race. And we explicitly require people who are involved with the Racial Justice Institute to talk about race. Now, now that's particularly important because, as you probably know, what's going on in society is an attempt to pretend that race does not exist,
Mm-hmm.
and that makes people crazy. Not only the people who are oppressed by that, but also the people who are doing the oppressing. Because if race doesn't exist, then who is it you are oppressing? What they don't recognize is they're actually oppressing themselves too.
Mm-hmm.
So the Psychologists for Racial Justice always want to keep the emphasis on resistance for people of color, especially Black people. How do we resist racism? The positivity of being a person of color, But we also have in the background that issue of racism. What is racism doing? How do we untangle it? How do we recognize it? How do we make it visible so that it doesn't have power over you, so that it doesn't have invisible power over you, so that you know exactly what the game is and what the rules are and can begin to deal with it in whatever context you're focusing on.
Thank you.
We also have a video conference every year, so people are invited to take a look for us in March.
That's very important. As you said, the current um, social climate and political climate where people are trying to act like race isn't a thing and even get rid of the diversity, equity, inclusion language, which, as you said, was even further removed from race and multiculturalism, was to even take that language and make it unacceptable. It really that type of research, being explicit about race is definitely necessary. One last question, and I will give you back your time today. So if we think about research into race and racism, what interests you most about the past of that type of research? And where do you think that research should be going moving forward?
Well, if I think about it in terms of, well, first in terms of psychology, what always interests me is the parallel voices or the extent to which Black accomplishments have, in psychology are invisible. In psychology, we actually define racism according to the definitions of a Black social psychologist, James Jones, who in his dissertation originated the concepts of systemic, institutional, and cultural racism, which are the ways that people have begun to talk about racism, although they don't necessarily recognize the differences, but that's how they began to talk about it. And that was the research that he did in his dissertation um, many years ago. If we trace the history of Black scholars in psychology, all of them were writing about things that now have begun to be visible to people as being important, although they don't necessarily go back and recognize that those were the people who said these things were important. And so the past has been always in psychology emphasizing the white traditional without recognizing the origins of the white traditional. We look at psychological theories like Maslow's hierarchy and don't recognize the extent to which they came from indigenous cultures
Mm.
and how they are a distortion of those cultures. So, how I think about racism studies in the future is that, or and in general, is that I think reclaim, we have to reclaim the history, the knowledge of the peoples who were not white and integrate those so that we begin to have a psychology that works for people whose orientations are not what we think they are. For example, psychology thinks about people as individuals. Individualism is the characteristic. But in fact, people are not individualistic. They're community oriented.
Mhm.
And so the psychologists talk about separating from your community. The people of color theories talk about integrating with your communities. You can't really function all by yourself as an individual. You have to integrate with a community. So what I see is us having to begin to think about different ways of how we think about people that are not defined by the hierarchical power system, but more communal, more community oriented, more knowledge and information is shared and valued between groups. And I think if that can happen, then you will say I'm being idealistic. But if that can happen, then it becomes more complicated to be racist.
Mm. I
because
think that's true.
because then people are more like you.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's I mean, there are examples of that, like historical examples of, where there was communities that were cultivated based upon shared concerns or shared positionality, um, that crossed races. Things were able to happen until they were shut down by
The
racist
white power
aims.
structure. I say by white heterosexual men with power and privilege.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's my WIMP theory. We didn't talk about that one today.
Do you want to? Because I would love to hear more about that one.
WIMP theory?
Yes.
Uh, okay, you asked for it. Um, White heterosexual men with power and privilege essentially founded the country. And so they wrote a constitution that protected themselves and protected their power. And we all pretend that they didn't, but they did. Because if they had wanted uh, to free the enslaved Black people, for instance, they would have said, we're freeing the enslaved Black people. But they didn't say that in the Constitution. Uh, in fact, the only people that are implied and well mentioned in the Constitution are indigenous people, who they called Indians. That's the only group. The only gender is by implication men. They use the he pronoun. But everyone else, the only way they are defined is in terms of their property, their value to white heterosexual men with power and privilege. Now, you talked about unions. We can almost define when Black people became Black and white people became white in society. We can almost give you the date. It was, and you probably know this because you're a history person, but I'll say it just to be redundant. The Francis Bacon Rebellion,
Mhm.
which was essentially white enslaved people and Black enslaved people forming a union to overthrow the oppressive government. Well, what what happened was that Francis Bacon, like all of the leaders, got mysteriously got sick and died, um, and so the rebellion ended. But what happened was that the white heterosexual men with power and privilege were afraid that it would happen again because they came so close to overturning the government in Virginia, I think. So what they did is they said we have to differentiate between these slaves so that they will not join forces with each other again.
Mhm.
So how do we do this? So the way they did that was because the African descent enslaved people were visually uh, uh, more colorful and therefore more recognizable. They said, we'll make them Black. And because the other ones, the poor other white people who were not white at the time, they said, we'll make them white. And to make that even better, we'll separate their housing so that they don't live with each other. We won't give them any more food, but we will tell them that they were better because they have separate housing. And that's how race and racism began. That's how the myth of white superiority began, and that's how the Constitution maintained it for us. And what that means is that every generation of white people that's either born or immigrated to the country they're born into that myth. Every Black person or person of color who comes into the country, they're born into that myth. And so we're always fighting against a myth that's a founding principle of our country. And so we kind of have to recognize that that's the case and not just fight the symptoms, but fight the myth, which I contend we did not do in the last election.
I would agree with that. Yeah. And I mean, I think every time there is a opportunity to fight the myth on a larger level, it is once again struck down and reinforced.
Yeah, I I even wrote about it once, nobody would publish it, but in fact, what happens is whenever the wealth and power of white heterosexual men with power and privilege is at risk, what they do is, they trigger the buffer class of white people, so the poor in the middle white people, they trigger them. So they do something that will hurt them, and then they accuse the, either, people of color or, uh, women or whoever the not white men group is at the time, they accuse them of being responsible. So it's like when unemployment is high, it's not because the white men are not creating jobs. It's because the people of color are taking your jobs, white people. And so then that directs the anger towards the people of color. And we saw that in great action over the election year.
Yes. That's yes, precisely what happened over the election year. It's unfortunate that nobody would publish that piece because I think it's necessary.
Well, one of my mottos is if I can't get the message through one way, I'll get it through another way. And so sooner or later, I'll get it in writing or get it published in writing because as long as we don't understand the manipulation, we can be manipulated.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, thank you.
You're
Thank you so
welcome.
much for your time and for your work that you're continuing to do, um, in the area of psychology and race and racial justice is profoundly important. Is there anything you would like to add before I give you back your day?
Uh, just encourage people to um, stay woke by whichever uh, meaning you get that term. Certainly, woke for people of color means understanding the racism in its various manifestation. Woke for whites means whites obtaining knowledge about existing racism. And so my motto is when someone says, I'm anti woke, then you just ask them, are you opposed to whites obtaining knowledge about existing racism?
That's a nice comeback.
Yes.
Well, thank you so, so much again. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.